All right, I want to talk to you today about the Moravians. I was planning on doing it 2 weeks ago, and I intentionally broke it off because there is more about this group that I want to talk about that really paves the way for where we are today in several ways. One is that the Moravians have an outpost right here in North Carolina. In fact, what you're going to find is that many of these denominations that we're talking about have played a part in North Carolina history. And so it's just really interesting. Does anybody know, this is a question, does anybody know what the majority of those who are religious in North Carolina, what their denomination is? Does anybody know? Not Catholic, not Lutheran, not Methodist, Baptists. So North Carolina is predominantly Baptist nowadays. The reason why you said Lutheran is because in this area, it was settled by lots and lots of Germans. And so in this area that we live, historically, it is predominantly two different denominations. One Lutheran, the other is this area, right here, right around Cabarrus County. So on this side, we have, somebody tell me the name of the golf course in Kannapolis where we have our golf outing. Irish Creek. So now, Irish is not a religion, y'all. Irish is a nationality. So Presbyterians on this side. Somebody said Dutch. Dutch is actually the word, the way we use it, Deutsch, which is German, not Amsterdam Dutch. So Germans on this side of the county, now you got me doing it. German Lutherans on this side of the county, Scot-Irish Presbyterians on this side of the county. And so that's why you view Lutherans as predominant. But in North Carolina, it's actually the Baptists are the majority. But it was also in North Carolina that was the home, actually South Carolina, right here in Charlotte, was the home of a big movement of charismatics or old school Pentecostals, which would be the PTL club. So there's that influence in our area. And today we're talking about the Moravians, who are up in Winston-Salem or Old Town Salem area. So it's just interesting. One of the first things I did, and I would recommend, if you have reading time, if you take time to, you say, I need to read more or something like this, get you a good North Carolina history book. The one that I read was printed by University of North Carolina, and so, sorry, Jill, that I didn't see any North Carolina State history books out there, so I just got the closest one I could. But it was super interesting about North Carolina history. So it's one of the first things I did when I came here, because I want to be able to relate to the way that you think and those kind of things. By the way, did you know that some of the bloodiest battles of the Revolutionary War in North Carolina took place after 1776? So after we had already declared ourselves a nation, and then after we had already won the Revolutionary War against the British, North Carolinians, surprise, surprise, kept fighting. Right? They kept fighting, and it wasn't NC State that was fighting. It was the Highlander Scots. The Highlanders were radically loyalists to the king. And the rest, as you know, of North Carolina was radically patriotic, what we would call patriots, but for the new colonies. And so those two clashed for years and years until finally but I don't mean like 30 years, I mean like 7 or 8 years after we were a nation, until finally they ran the Highland Scots out of North Carolina. Anybody want to guess? No, you're tired of guessing now. They went to Florida. So like they moved en masse so if you go over to Newbern and you look around, you'll see that there's a strong influence of Scottish history there. They've got a big bear standing in their downtown area. They've got all that kind of stuff. So New Bern is that Scottish. I said Scottish. They're Swiss. They've got a Swiss, but they had a lot of Scots that moved there in that Highland area. The Highlanders moved to that area, and so they got kicked out down to Florida. And so I've got a friend who is super patriotic. His last name is Gunn, Gunn, which is Scottish, and he is super patriotic, loves the Revolutionary War. And so after I read that, I went back to him. I said, "Your ancestors were probably loyalists. They probably weren't patriots." He didn't like that at all. But so anyway, history is really cool because it tells us why we think the way we do. North Carolina is one of the most ready to fight states I've ever been in, right? You know, they'll fight at the drop of the hat, and sometimes they'll drop the hat, right? I mean, it's just supercharged, that kind of patriotic, our way or the highway kind of stuff, right? You think everybody in the whole world eats hot dogs with chili and slaw on them. And so it's just, they don't. I'm just telling you, they don't. They do here, they don't everywhere. I don't know why they wouldn't, but they don't. So maybe after they've tried it, then they do. Yeah. But what's that? Slaw. Yeah, chili and slaw. The Carolina dog, right? So I grew up eating chili dogs, but it was always mustard and cheese and chili, no slaw and had the cheese on it. So what's that? Onions make your breath sound. Ugh. So anyway, I just want you to know that you are products of history. You didn't just get plopped down. Miss Carol, what do you like on your hot dog? Onions. Well, you're from Georgia. Yeah. I've got a joke about Georgia, but it's impolite, so I won't say it. Oh, my goodness. So much fun. All right. No, I don't eat onions on my hot dogs. I mean, I know people do, but all I have to do is get a whiff of those things, and they're just like, what about a hamburger? I like chili on my hamburger. Well, anyway, we're way afield. We need to get back to the Moravians. Who likes cookies? All right, there you go. Moravian cookies, we're back. Here we go. I want to read you something. Now, this is one of those legendary statements. Nobody knows if this is really true or not, but in the future, people seized on this. So we're going to talk about a guy by the name of John Huss. John Huss and the Hussites are a pre-Lutheran Protestant group. They came out of Bohemia and Moravia, which were eventually, they weren't necessarily nations at that time. They were regions. And so it's where we get the name Bohemians, Bohemian Rhapsody. I see a little silhouette of a man, Scaramouche, Scaramouche. Can you do the fandango? Thunderbolts and lightning, very, very frightening. All right, so that's where we get Bohemian. And then we get the Moravians from that as well. And so this is the area now of Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, Slovakia, that area. So Eastern Central Europe. And John Huss, I'll tell you more about him in just a second, but when he was getting tied to the stake to be burned as a heretic, he said these words. By the way, the word, you need to know this, his name Huss means goose. That's what it is. A Huss in that language is a goose. So we would say it goose. So his name is John Goose. But he says this, you are now going to burn a goose, but in a century, you will have a swan you can neither roast nor boil. And so when Martin Luther came along 100 years later, he claimed that he was the swan that you can neither roast nor boil. And so that's part of the legacy of the Protestant Reformation, is that it was, we talked last time about a guy named Wycliffe, and Wycliffe led the kind of predated John Huss, and John Huss paved the way for Martin Luther. And there is one invention that happened between John Huss's life and Martin Luther's life that made Luther successful in a way that Huss couldn't be successful. Would anybody like to guess the invention? The printing press. It was. In between, the Bible was printed on this movable type printing press, and it's what paved the way for the Protestant Reformation in Luther's day. But you're going to hear things that John Huss says that is really going to really change the way you look at history, or at least it did me. So here we go. Let's talk about this together. Let's talk about John Huss. We'll start here with him. He was born in 1369, somewhere between 1369 and 1375. There's several different records, but the most accurate that I could find was 1369. And he was martyred on the 6th of July in 1415. So we're only talking about him being 45 years, somewhere between 40 and 45 years old. So not a long time. He was at about 10 years old, he was sent to a monastery. They don't know why he was sent. Some think that it was because his dad died and so he was left orphaned. Others believe that he was super spiritual even early on, and so they sent him to be educated in this monastery. Now recognize this, that in those days, if you were sent to a monastery, you were going to receive a better education than the average person in the area. Even though he was an orphan, and even though he was probably poorer than most of the other people around, because he was sent to this monastery, he was given a first-class education by those monks who were there. You'll see this pattern, by the way. Martin Luther became a monk. He went to a monastery, but he was educated in a public university earlier on. But you're going to see this idea of the Catholic monasteries as a breeding ground for revolutionary thought, or reformational thought, if you want to use that word. So around 10, he was sent there. In 1698, he began teaching at the University of Prague. Yeah, 1390. I read it off there. 1390. I told you he wasn't 300 years old. So in 1398, he began teaching at the University of Prague. He eventually became the president of the University of Prague, and recognized that in those days the universities were extremely religious in their nature. So theology was always known as the queen of sciences. So all the other sciences flowed from the search for the nature and meaning of God. And so theology led that way. In fact, in America, our greatest, what we would call Ivy League schools today, all started as religious training grounds, seminaries. So Princeton, Harvard, Yale, all of those, they started off really making preachers. Jonathan Edwards was the president of Princeton for some time. I may have said that wrong. He was the president of Harvard. Even into the 20th century, Princeton was a leading Presbyterian school, even into the 20th century. How times have changed. And I would say that lots of the reasons our times have changed is because we've forgotten history. We've walked away from our roots. Thank you. So in his lectures, he defended Wycliffe's views. So he was a Wycliffite, even though the Catholic Church had declared Wycliffe's views and teachings as heretical to the church. So remember, Wycliffe wanted a Bible in everybody's language. He wanted not the Pope to lead, but rather local bishops to lead. He wanted freedom away from the political realm. So the Pope was bringing church and state together, and they were wanting to divide that. So all of this is running in the background of John Huss, or John Huss. He was ordained a Catholic priest in 1400. And so for the next 15 years, he served as a priest and a professor. I just like this name because we sing Jolly Good King Wenceslas. So Wenceslas was the king of Bohemia, and he ordered both the bishops and the university in Prague to remain neutral during the Western Schism. Now, I briefly talked about the Western Schism last time. That was when there was a pope in France and there was a pope in Rome. And so what Wenceslas is doing is saying, we're not going to side with either, which in effect made them more independent, right? So by saying we're not going to side with the Frankish pope, or we're not going to side with the Roman pope, what they're doing is saying we're going to teach what we believe right here in Bohemia. And so he gave Huss even more strength to voice his opinions about the way that church is supposed to go. So Huss preached against the indulgences and the Pope. So we haven't talked really about indulgences yet. We'll talk in extent about them when we get to Luther. But what they were doing was bankrolling lots of their buildings in the Roman Catholic Church by selling indulgences. Now, what these indulgences were, let's say that Brother Larry, let's say that he's a good Catholic and that his dad was a good Catholic, but even good Catholics don't go right to heaven. They go where first? Purgatory, right, to work off their minor sins. So let's say Brother Larry's a good Catholic, his dad was a good Catholic, his dad's in purgatory now, and so every day, Brother Larry and Miss Carol stop by their local church and they light a candle and give an offering in order to pray his dad out of purgatory to be released to heaven. Well, now there's this guy that comes around like an insurance salesman, and he comes and he's allowed to speak, except he comes from the Roman Catholic Church. He's not from the Hartford or from Prudential or from any of those. He's from the Roman Catholic Church, and he comes into a group like this and he says, for $1,000, I will sell you this indulgence from the Pope that'll release your ancestors out of purgatory. And Brother Larry's thinking, well, I've already given $1,000 over time to buy the candle, to light it so I can pray for my dad. So I'm just going to give it all at once now, and the Pope will let him loose. And so Larry gives me $1,000, and I give him this certificate that says your dad is now free from purgatory. I then take that $1,000, probably take a cut of it myself, and then take the rest of it back to the Pope and put it in the treasury, and they use that now to rebuild or remodel St. Peter's Basilica in Rome or whatever. That's what the indulgences were doing. They also paid for the armies that were being sent around in the name of the Pope to fight. In fact, what we're going to see is after Huss dies, there's going to be a revolution in Bohemia, and the Pope is going to send armies, and it's called crusade, against Bohemia because of their following after Huss's teachings. So Huss preached against the indulgences and the Pope. He was country before country was cool, right? So Luther is really built on this in his own area. Now, I'm not saying Luther was a copycat. Luther was a gift to the church from God. I believe that completely. But he didn't just appear out of nowhere. He followed the teachings of others. He followed the ideas of others, and John Huss was singular in those ideas. So he led a great movement of Bohemians against the teachings of the medieval church. So they're now starting to believe what he's teaching. He's teaching that you need to follow Jesus. He's teaching that you can't pray your way out of heaven in some way, or out of purgatory. In some ways, some people even attribute that there's a rejection of purgatory at all in the teachings of Wycliffe and Huss, and then Luther follows up with that. So there is a real movement against the medieval Roman church and all of their teachings, which is radical in their day because the Roman church had cornered the market in Europe on what right looked like, what orthodoxy looked like. In fact, Huss is going to be burned at the stake as a heretic for believing things that you and I believe freely today. So I just want you to recognize that he wasn't a heretic like he believed bad things about God. It was that he was a heretic because he believed bad things about the Roman church. And so over time, and we're just talking about the next 15 years, he's gaining adherents all around his area. So because Wenceslaus said that we're not going to follow either of those popes, the people are going to listen to the leading voices of their own. And the leading voice in their area was John Huss. And so they are following, you could say they swallowed what he was selling hook, line, and sinker. They're completely following after him. So on the 1st of November in 1414, Huss was given a promise of safe passage to speak at the Council of Constance. It's the 14th. Remember I said that originally there were 7 councils in the Roman church that most East and West believe are establishing orthodoxy. Most of them about the Trinity, the nature of Christ, all of those kinds of things. So those are 7 councils. We're now at the 14th council, and it's called the Council of Constance. And they told him to come and present his views with a guarantee of safe passage. And so he came out of hiding, and they arrested him. So not good faith on the part of those who were around him. But he was promptly arrested. That's 1st of November in 1414. In the next 7 months, 8 months, they tried him. They asked him to recant. They did all kinds of things. But on the 6th of July, he was executed burned at the stake for heresy because of his views against the Roman church. Now, remember what's going on now in Bohemia, in this area. They are his followers. They viewed him as their leader, as their teacher, their pastor, if you will. Although they had other pastors, but I mean, like this guy was the shining light of Bohemia. They loved him. They all followed after him. And so when they found out first that he was done dirty by telling that he had safe passage to come out and then arrested, and then second that he was killed at the stake, they revolted. They just completely turned against John Huss. And so on the 2nd of September that same year, so we're talking about 2 months later, nobles from Bohemia and Moravia signed what they called the Bohemian Protest against the Roman Church. And because they moved away from Rome, and by that I mean ideologically, not physically, like they didn't just pack up their stuff and move further away. They moved away ideologically. The Pope declared a crusade against all of the Bohemian people. And so they brought all of these armies to bear against the Bohemian people and began to exterminate them, began to kill them off. And all this happened in the 1400s. So it was out of this Bohemian Moravian Reformation, started by John Huss, followed up by others, 100 years before Luther, that the Moravian church emerged, right? So they came out of this. It was established in 1457 as a church, separate from the Roman Catholic Church. So let me say this. So Christianity originally started as a sect out of Judaism, right? So it was a group of Jews primarily, and then it expanded, but Jews primarily who realized that Jesus was the promised Messiah and that he fulfilled all of the Old Testament promises. In fact, Paul comes along and to his letter to Corinthians and says that Jesus is the yes and amen, meaning that he is the final statement of the Old Testament. Jesus himself said it. I didn't come to see the law abolished, but to fulfill it. And so there was a group of Jews who saw Jesus as the fulfillment. So early on with Huss and those folks, they viewed what they were doing as just reforming the Catholic Church. Now, for those of you who are Lutherans, that should ring a bell. It should, or anybody really that knows about Luther, that's what Luther started out to do. All he wanted to do was bring moral purity and doctrinal purity, biblical teaching back to the church. That's what Luther did. That's what Huss tried to do. That's what Wycliffe tried to do. All of these guys weren't trying to overthrow the church. They were simply trying to make it right again, to bring it back. As an aside, to bring it all the way to today, there are a group of bishops and preachers meeting right now, first week of March 2026, in Africa, and they are a movement within Anglicanism, the Church of England, who are trying to right the ship of the Church of England, but in doing so, they're saying that the Archbishop of Canterbury is not in charge of them. Can't say that. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of the Anglican Church. That's not quite true. The King of England is the head of the Anglican Church, but the Archbishop of Canterbury is the leading theologian of the Anglican Church. And this is the first female Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury that she is getting ready to come in, and they are rejecting that, and they're also rejecting their acceptance of LGBTQ stuff, marriages and other things that the Anglican Church is blessing. And so this group of African, mainly African, but we would say global, let's say global because there's Asians there as well. Global Anglicans are coming together and saying we need to reform the church. So just keep your eyes open. It'll probably end up splitting, even though their goal is to reform the church. They'll end up having to split because nobody who's like the Pope or the Archbishop or anybody like that is going to give up their right to lead. And so it'll end up probably splitting. But that's happening right now. They're meeting as we speak, and you can go look that up and see what they're talking about. But I read that just today as a background to this. So they came about not wanting to split, but eventually, because of the harsh reaction, which was war, against them by the Roman Catholic Church in 1457, a monk named Brother Gregory became dissatisfied with the Hussites' willingness to stay within the church and broke away and started the Church of Moravia, or what we would call the Moravian Church. They didn't call it that. They didn't call it the Moravian Church yet. What they called it was the unity of the brethren. So if y'all heard the brethren, there's lots of different kinds of brethren, Plymouth Brethren, United Evangelical Brethren, but this is the first time that they called themselves the Unity of the Brethren, and it was the Moravian Church. This society was based on the Sermon on the Mount and was both pacifistic and communitarian. So communitarian means that everybody had everything in common, and they lived in a society or a village or a commune where everybody would bring their wares together and then they would distribute it back out. Now, the reason why he did this was not because he read Karl Marx. Karl Marx didn't live until the 1800s. It was because they read the book of Acts and saw that everybody had all things in common, and so they really made this society a communistic type society, not Marxist, but everybody bringing their stuff together and sharing with others as they need. They were also pacifistic. Remember, they had just suffered under the military advance of the Pope. So let's talk about pacifism. This is the first time we've really seen it. What do y'all know about pacifism as a Christian thought? Does anybody know anything about it? Do you think it's an easy thing to deal with? No, it's not. We in America, because of the way America came about, we typically are not pacifists. But there is a very clear teachings in the Sermon on the Mount that if you're going to really deal with the text, you have to come to grips with what it means to defend yourself, what it means to take and bear arms, what it means to do all of these things. I am not what I would say a pacifist, but I am very pacifistic. I really believe that most wars are fought by people who have lots of money by people who don't have lots of money, right? I really think that the common man pays for decisions made by people who never have to defend their own thing. I also believe that Jesus meant it when he says, if somebody hits you on the one cheek, we have to turn the other cheek, right? So you have to really deal with this kind of thought, this kind of pacifism thought. Now, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of theologians who do not go in this way. In fact, Augustine, all the way back in the 400s, came up with a just war theory, not just war, but just, righteous war theory, and that it was used by the Roman Church all the way up until this time. So 1,000 years it had been using that as its theory. To this day, many Christians still hold to the just war theory. I didn't come prepared to talk about it, but the just war theory basically says you have to have a righteous cause, you have to have the right to do it, so a cause that is just, and you have to be in authority to be able to commit this war, and it can't go beyond what the cause is. So you have to declare your war, you have to fight the war, and you have to pull back once that cause is met, or once that justice is met. And we still use that to some extent today. And by the way, when we don't, it's what's got us in trouble, with what we call mission creep. So the Vietnam War, whether it was just or not, you could say so or not say so, but it stopped being just when we kept up at it, even though we weren't accomplishing our goal. Same thing with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, this one that we've just come out of. You could say that it stopped being just when we kept losing life and not gaining objectives, when we just kept up and kept up. So all of those things are in Augustine's just war theory. But throughout the history of the church, there have been different folks who have said that Augustine was wrong, that there is no cause for just war when you're following Jesus, that Jesus told us to turn the other cheek, that Jesus told us to give the cloak off our back, that Jesus told us to pray for your enemies and all those things. And so there are some very strong arguments for pacifism. We'll talk about these folks later, but the Mennonites are very pacifistic. In fact, that's a dumb thing to say. They are pacifists. And so there are folks in the history. Anybody heard the story of Sergeant York? Sergeant York from Tennessee. He was a great warrior, but he started it all out as a conscientious objector, and somebody talked him into going and doing his duty, and so he went. That's all the Sergeant York story. It's also the story of the medic that Chaplain Carver spoke about last week. And what's that called? The movie that was made of it. No, it's not Private Ryan. It's not Heartbreak Ridge, but it's something Ridge. Hacksaw Ridge. That's it. Thank you. And so that's the story of a medic who was a conscientious objector, but who ended up saving a lot of people because of his religious drive. And so this is all very interesting. So the Moravians started out as pacifists in this society. They called themselves the Unity of the Brethren. And in 1467, they established their own clergy. So originally, it was just clergy from the Roman Catholic Church who came over. But in 1467, 10 years later, they started their own bishops and their own clergy. So they were completely a separate entity from the Roman Church by this point. When you can set up your own training and your own order of ministers, you are now existentially a different organization. And so that's what they did. As the Habsburgs, everybody heard of the Habsburgs? Austria-Hungary. So this is what this area became. The Habsburgs took over from jolly good King Wenceslas and his folks and brought it back under Roman Catholic rule. So they brought this Moravia and Bohemia and these areas back into the Holy Roman Empire, and which was Roman Catholic. They kind of ruled. They didn't kind of rule. They ruled from the 1440s until 1806, when Napoleon beat them, overthrew them. So we're talking about 400 years almost of rule by one family, the Habsburg Empire. Their staunch Catholicism threatened all of these splinter movements in the area that they controlled. So now it's not just the Roman Catholic Church that's after the Moravians, the Hussites, those folks, but now their own rulers are after them, the people who took over from Wenceslas and his folks. So by the early 1700s, they had almost destroyed the Unity of the Brethren, this offshoot splinter group who is becoming the Moravian Church. Everybody good so far? I haven't lost anybody? Is this interesting at all to you? Okay, good. I tell you, I geek out over this stuff. I get really, woo, man, this is awesome. And I just want to make sure y'all are with me, and y'all are at least, you don't have to think it's awesome, but informative would be enough. Informative would be enough. As long as you're not getting ready to leave, that's good. So, in 1722, so here we are, by the early 1700s, they had almost destroyed the Unity of the Brethren. By 1722, the Brethren took refuge on a Saxony prince's estate. Now, Saxony is one of the areas that eventually became Germany. All right, by the way, Anglo-Saxons, it was the folks from Saxony moved to the British Isles and became the Anglo-Saxons. So but this is way after that. But anyway, so in 1722, the Brethren took refuge on a Saxony prince's estate. His name, Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Anybody ever heard of Zinzendorf? You should have, because Zinzendorf revolutionized the Moravian church. Now, you may not have known that he was a Moravian. What you probably heard about Zinzendorf was that he was a great missionary, and that he funded, because of his money, the very beginning of what we know as the mission enterprise now. So Zinzendorf is a model for what the Southern Baptists did 150 years later, right? So his actions immediately led to the Baptists in North America saying, we need to be missionary in what we do. So we do missions weekend, we give to missions, we are a missionary church. In fact, every Southern Baptist church should be a missionary church. We are missionaries because of Zinzendorf, the Moravian church. That's another reason why I'm spending so much time on the Moravians. Even though they're only a small number now, these folks impacted the Lutherans and impacted the Baptists. And so this is a huge movement in its ripples. Just like when you throw a small stone into a pond, it causes a ripple that goes way beyond the size of that stone. So too is the Moravian movement. This is how big and influential their thought was. In fact, Zinzendorf would send his missionaries out 2 by 2, and they would pack their belongings in a casket because they were going to stay. They were going to stay. They weren't coming back. They were going to die wherever they were going. That's how radical they were. They founded a place called Herrnhut on Zinzendorf's property. And by the way, property, don't think 18 acres, right? We're talking about a large county. That's where counties get their name, from the counts who run them. And so a large county, they built this town called Herrnhut, and it was a community built on these ideals: pacifism, missionary doctrine, communal guidance. So Herrnhut, and Zinzendorf, a Lutheran, by the way, I didn't tell you that. Zinzendorf was a Lutheran at this time, became their bishop of the Moravian church. Under Zinzendorf, they reestablished evangelism as the great mission of the church. Now, the reason why I say reestablished is because all the way back with John and Peter and Paul and Andrew and Thomas and Philip, all of those guys, they were missionaries. The original church was missional. Over time, it had lost that. Zinzendorf reestablished evangelism as the great mission of the church. And so they greatly impacted the African slaves in the Virgin Islands. Anybody ever been to St. Thomas? So Moravians Christianized St. Thomas. Not only St. Thomas, they ended up coming up into North America, and so they impacted Georgia. There you go, you Georgians here. Oh, by the way, what do we know about the colony of Georgia? Sir? Okay, so it was a penal colony. Who founded the penal colony? It was a British penal colony. So they sent their cast-offs, their prisoners, and those folks there. It was also a leading Anglican place. Because it was a crown colony, there were the other colonies, North Carolina, which, by the way, was just Carolina at the time before it split up, north and south. But the Carolinas, actually, does anybody know the name of the Carolinas' first name? From England. Albemarle. Albemarle is the name. So Albemarle was the name of the area before it became North Carolina, South Carolina. And Virginians here, I know you, Virginians. So Virginia was a colony that was, I see that hand. Virginians was given, it was signed over to somebody to run it. Same with North and South Carolina. Georgia was not. Georgia stayed a crown colony until Declaration of Independence, and we became independent. Because of that, at that time, the leading religion was Anglicanism. And so the two preachers that were best known for Anglicanism, easy for me to say, was a guy by the name of George Whitefield. And so he preached in Savannah. He had a play. And by the way, George Whitefield was a great preacher. And another guy by the name of John Wesley. Does anybody know that name? How many Methodists do we have here? He is the founder of the Methodist Church. But before he was the founder of the Methodist Church, he was an Anglican. And so the Moravians went to Georgia and led John Wesley to Jesus. And when I say that, I mean he was already a preacher, already a priest, but he did not have a heart relationship with Jesus. It was the Moravians who did that. So you know the rest of the story. We'll get to it later when we get to the Anglican Church and the Methodists. But he goes back to England and he starts a Bible study with his brother Charles and some other guys, and they called it Bible Study Methods, right? And everybody made fun of them and called them Methodists. Well, they were trying to reform Anglicanism from the inside, and it didn't go very well. And so they split off, and they became the Methodist Church, or that's the starting of the Methodist Church. So it was the Moravians. Not only did the Moravians impact the Lutherans, not only did the Moravians impact the missionary zeal of the Southern Baptists, but the Moravians also are the reason that the Methodists exist. So we're talking about a small group of people, Moravians, who you go up in the Old Salem and buy their cookies. They revolutionized evangelicalism. I mean, it's just an amazing footprint for such a small group of people from a place that most of us don't. Moravia sounds so foreign and distant, and yet they impacted not only that, but wait, there's more. So they go up into Ohio area, which was not a colony yet. It was just a wild wilderness, and they led a whole tribe of American Indians, Native Americans, to the Lord. And they were called Moravian Indians. But they were all decimated, exterminated really, by the U.S. militia in 1782. Again, that manifest destiny that was taking Americans from east to west and pretty much killing everything in its path all the way. And so there wasn't much left of this, of the Moravian Indians there in Ohio. As the late 1700s, early 1800s came around and more immigration came from Germany and from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the Moravians' footprint spread up into what we would call the Midwestern or the prairie states, North Dakota, Minnesota, and do I have somewhere else in there? Where else did they go? I may have taken it out of there. Yeah, I did. So North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, up in there, and so they have a footprint there as well. But North Carolina is still their largest footprint in existence there, as it's celebrated in Old Salem and around Winston-Salem. So their lasting impact is noted in North Carolina, and with reestablishing missions as the aim of the evangelical church. If you go to our history, the 1800s, who were the greatest two groups, actually I'll say three, just to include all three of them, in the pioneer frontier area. It was the Baptists, it was the Methodists, and it was the Presbyterians. And they were all impacted by John Huss and the Moravians. So all of the movement, you could say the Second Great Awakening in America was done because of the work of the Moravians back between the 1400s and the 1700s. Just an incredible, incredible story. Their motto, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, love. And so that is the unity of the brethren, or the brethren unity. So that's where it came from. Their emblem is awesome. It's the triumphant lamb. If you've ever seen a lamb, you might have seen this on a stained glass window. It's a lamb with a flag that leans up over his shoulder, and he's walking forward and looking out. That's theirs. Other people have used it now, but that's their symbol, and it's the victorious Lamb of God on crusade, on the move, and that's the Moravian Church's picture. Isn't that cool? And it's right here in North Carolina. We all ought to go and take a pilgrimage back to Old Salem now and recognize what we're looking at, because it really is basic to our evangelical beliefs. Yes, ma'am, I see that hand.
Where does the Moravian star come from? Because my family used to put it up on the Christmas tree back when I was a kid.
I do not know that answer, but I will find out for you and get back with you.
Got many points and things.
Right? I'm familiar with the pic, but in all my reading, I didn't run across it. Or if I did, I wasn't paying attention when I read it. I mean, I didn't. I tend to pull things out that that mean something to me, either historically or something, but because I didn't grow up around here, I had never had a Moravian cookie until our young hearts went to Old Salem a few years ago. So I was not familiar with that side of things here in North Carolina. I was only familiar with Zinzendorf before I've done this. Yes, ma'am.
It wasn't North Carolina. I mean, this is my family up in Indiana, if that makes any difference.
Right. No. I know what you mean. I just don't know the cultural stuff is what I should have said, not North Carolina stuff. I don't know the cultural hand-me-downs that would have been. But I'll find out for you. It won't take long for me to figure that out. So that's the Moravians. Let's talk about what they believe just for a second. Their belief is that the Bible is the Word of God, and they say it is the sole guide for doctrine and faith. Now, that is a radical statement for people coming out of the Roman Catholic Church. Remember, the Roman Catholic Church said there were 3 standards for their authority. The Bible, as interpreted, by the way, by the history, the fathers, by tradition, church tradition, and the Pope, or the magisterium. So those 3 were what guided the Roman Church, still do guide the Roman Church. But now we've got these folks coming out of the Roman Church to say, au contraire, mon frère, except they would have said it in German, or Czech. But they would say that the Bible alone is the Word of God. So it has to be the standard of all reformers. Because if you're going to reform something, it means you go back to something, going back to a standard. And so the only standard that they had was the Bible. And so they go back. It's the sole guide for doctrine and faith. They believe God is triune, that Jesus is the eternal Son and Redeemer, that He rose from the dead and ascended to heaven. Now you say, well, I believe that. You should. Because that is Orthodox Christianity. That is basic apostolic Christianity, that God is triune, Jesus is the eternal Son and Redeemer, and that He rose from the dead and ascended to heaven. So when they burned Huss at the stake, they weren't burning him because he was that kind of a heretic that went away from these basic things. It was because he dared question the Roman Church and the authority of the Roman Church. So they believe about sin and salvation. Now, this is radically different than what the medieval church was teaching. They believe that mankind is fallen in sin, and that to be saved, one must have a personal, faith-based relationship with Jesus Christ. That should ring all kinds of bells, because this is the first time in this setting that we've talked about that we're seeing people who believe in salvation exactly like we do. Exactly like we do. We believe that to be saved, one must repent of their sins and put their faith in Jesus. Why is it the same as the Moravians? Did we copy them? They went back to the Bible. And we went back to the Bible. And as long as you go back to the Bible, you're going to come up with the same answer. And that's the answer that the Bible brings about. I'm being a little childish about this, but I want you to really see that this will be going forward as we start next week with Luther. This is the drumbeat of biblical Christianity now. Go back to the Bible. Back to the Bible. What does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? And this is the emergence. You're going to have so many denominations come out of this because they're going back to the Bible, they're following their consciences, and they're trying to reform what looked and really was broken in the medieval Roman Catholic Church. Everybody good so far? I mean, this is just radical. Now here's some places that they deviate a little bit. They practiced baptism of both infants and believers, and their mode of baptism was typically sprinkling. So we're not talking about a Baptistic movement. We're just talking about a movement back to the Bible, going back. And I'll just tell you this, that and you're going to see it in Luther, you're going to see it in Calvin, you're going to see it even in us, that nobody has cornered the market on perfect Christianity. We're trying to get back there, and I believe that the first statement has to be, we got to do it like the Bible says it. But over time, what happens is traditions, like it or not, build up around the Bible. And so what we have to do, if we want to really follow Jesus, is we have to question everything, but the answer is always the Bible. So we question things. When I introduced the idea of pacifism to you before, I know what you think. You're like, man, you were a soldier. How can you be a pacifist? I'm not really a pacifist, but I have to be willing to ask the question, is that what Jesus wants from us? And then we have to go and find out. We have to know why we believe what we believe. Same thing with, let's say, poverty. There have been movements throughout history where people have said, we're going to renounce everything we own and we're going to follow Jesus as impoverished people. Well, most of them get that from Jesus' interaction with the rich young ruler. Most people that I have heard preach that immediately discount that as a possibility from what Jesus was trying to say. Now, I get why they do that, but if we're going to be faithful to the Word, we have to at least be willing to ask the question, what did Jesus mean when he said that? And not have a canned answer for it. Let's go back and see what the Bible says. Jesus himself said you can't serve both God and money. What's that mean? Jesus said turn the other cheek. What's that mean? What's it look like in a nation? What's it look like for individuals in a nation? I believe that nations have been given the power of the sword. The Bible says that. And so I do not believe that war is against God in the sense that nations can't wage it. But what does that mean for Christians? What should Christians do in that setting? Should we be conscientious objectors? Should we go and serve? I believe that's a personal conviction, one of those things. But we need to be willing to go back to Scripture and ask those questions, not just have a standard answer. And by the way, everything I'm saying to you is a very Baptist way of saying this, because we hold to what we call soul competency, or the idea that we can't do anything that overshadows or binds our consciences. So Brother Larry can say, I believe this, and I can say, you have a right to believe that, but I don't believe that. And we can both be Baptists. It's why we don't have creeds and say you have to adhere to this thing. We say, no, let's go back to the Bible. The Bible is the sole rule and faith under the lordship of Jesus. And so that's a very Baptistic way of talking. So anyway, I bring all this up just to say that they didn't get there. They practiced baptism of both infants and believers, and the mode of baptism is typically sprinkling. So we wouldn't identify with their mode of baptism, and we wouldn't identify with their standard for church membership. So we really couldn't partner with them except in the mission effort of sharing the gospel around the world. They believe communion celebrates the benefits of belonging because of Jesus' suffering and death. That's close to what we believe. We really believe, I can't say we, after I just gave you the Baptist speech. I believe that the wafer and the cup is representative of Jesus' death in our place, and so we eat it for two reasons. We're declaring his death, and we recognize that he's coming back for us. And so that's my reasoning, that's my purpose of the Lord's Supper, and because Jesus told us to do it. So all of those things. But that's what they would say. So I could probably, accepting for their practice of baptism, I could take communion with them and mean the same thing with that. And then finally, they believe Jesus will return one day, but the timing and events surrounding that are unclear. That's the same thing I would say. I'd say I know Jesus is coming back. I don't know all the things that have to happen before that. The only two I know are that the man of lawlessness must appear and a great apostasy. And that's because the Bible says it clearly that that's what has to happen before Jesus comes back. So their beliefs are very similar to ours. You would not find great points of contention, at least with the early doctrinal Moravians. What they practice now, I don't know, because they're just so small in number. There's less than 100 congregations of Moravians left in North America. There's probably 100 congregations in the Metrolina area, the greater Charlotte area. There's probably 100 Baptist congregations here. So they're very small in number. So it's hard to trace what they really believe now. Any questions? Was that interesting? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just thought, I shouldn't say it like that, how God works. About the time in the 1775 is when Daniel Boone's movement, when everybody out west just wandered and probably took some of those people with him.
Yeah. Well, for sure the Moravians had an impact on other denominations' mission effort. Like other people saw what they were doing, heard what they were doing. So even by 1775, they weren't the only missionaries. By 1775, Wesley and his group were already on the move. The Baptists are already moving, but they're looking to these folks as the example of what it means to be on mission. So yeah, when as Americans, as bad as I just made it out earlier, because they killed a lot of folks when they went, but they also carried the gospel with them as they went. And so remember, there's an old saying, I can't remember who said it, but God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick, right? So he can take things that we don't necessarily mean for good and use them for good. He is the perfect author, so he can take fallen humans and make something out of us. Not that we are any better or worse necessarily, but God can make good things come from us. And that's something we need to remember. So yeah, absolutely. They are the initiators of the modern mission movement. They're the first ones. And so we all kind of tip our hat to Zinzendorf and his folks because of what they did for the rest of us. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think caused them to add, since they're so close to the Bible and their belief in what we believe? How did they come up with sprinkling babies?
Yeah, so it's not what they added, it's what they didn't subtract. So they had only ever seen sprinkling. They had only ever seen infant baptism, and so they kept it. It wasn't that they added it, it was that they kept it. Same thing with Luther. Luther didn't have time in his life to do everything that we would have wanted him to do, but he did a lot. And so we have to kind of take them for what they are. They were getting back to the Bible, but they didn't necessarily have time to overthrow it all or to change it all. In fact, what you're going to see is that the Anabaptists, A-N-A Baptists, which Mennonites came from that. There's a stream of Southern Baptists came from Anabaptism. Anna just means again. And so the Anabaptists were the first ones to start baptizing, people by immersion again, saying that their initial infant baptism didn't mean anything, that you had to be baptized from your confession of faith. And so the Roman church and the Reformed church began to drown them, saying that they were baptizing them again, and that's how they killed the Anabaptists. They call them heretics. Ultimately, lots of that is about who controls doctrine, because whoever controls doctrine controls everything else. And so that's what we'll see from Calvin and his group. They didn't want to be rivaled. They wanted to do something that was significant. But I get ahead of myself. It's just they didn't subtract it. They didn't have. I don't know if they didn't have time, or they didn't have the inclination, or they didn't have the creativity. Remember that they're reading the word baptism in Latin originally, and then when they bring it over into their language, often, like when it was brought into the King James language, it was not translated because King James was a Catholic. And he believed in infant baptism. He believed in sprinkling, not immersion. And even though baptizo means immerse, they kept it, they just transliterated it and made it baptism. And so now there's all kinds of different questions of what baptism really is. And it's mainly because of the traditions that we have, not because of we don't understand the word. Yes, ma'am.
Where did the idea of purgatory come from?
So the idea of purgatory came from one of the extra biblical writings that came out of Judaism, and it became part of the Roman Catholic canon when Jerome translated all of that stuff into Latin. And so there are more Bible books in the Roman Catholic canon than in our canon. And we have Luther to thank for that, by the way. Luther's the one that pared it down to what we have now. And it's because those other ones were never accepted by the early church or accepted by by Judaism before Christ. And so they would say they're non-authoritative and extra-biblical. So it came from that, and then it got built into the system. It is part and parcel of the Roman Catholic system. But the Eastern Orthodox do not believe that. The Eastern Orthodox have rejected purgatory. So it is simple. Purgatory is only a Catholic, and maybe some Anglicans hold to it, but it's only because the Anglicans use the same Bible. Pejoratively speaking, or derogatorily speaking, lots of people refer to the Anglican Church, the Church of England, as Catholic light. So it's very close to Catholicism. That's a good question, though. Any others? All right, was this good? You like that? All right, next week we're really going to get in the nitty-gritty. We're going to stop focusing on the small splinter groups, and we're going to look at Lutheranism, because Luther really is the powder keg that lights off the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. He is a large giant when it comes to Christianity. And so we'll spend some time talking about him and the Lutheran Church. By the way, in Germany, it's not called the Lutheran Church. We call it Lutheran Church over here. In Germany, it's called the Evangelical Church, Evangelisch. And so it's not called the Lutheran Church, it's called the Evangelical Church. And so we'll get into that next week. Everybody good? All right, I hope I didn't bore you to death. Hope you enjoyed some of this. I sure enjoyed it. And Becca, I'll find out about that Moravian star for you. All right, God bless you. Have a great day.